The British Empire did not die on a battlefield. It did not fall to an invading army, or surrender in a railway carriage, or lower its flag while a bugle played. The British Empire died on the telephone. On the 6th of November 1956, a broken, exhausted, heavily medicated Prime Minister in London picked up a phone, called the President of the United States, and effectively announced that 3 centuries of imperial power were over. And here is the detail that makes it almost unbearable. Britain was winning. Its soldiers were on the ground in Egypt, advancing, taking their objectives. Its commanders believed they could seize the entire Suez Canal within 24 hours, and they were ordered to stop. Not because they had been beaten, because the United States had found a weapon far more devastating than any bomb it could have dropped. Washington did not threaten to fight Britain. Washington threatened to sell British bonds. That was it. That was the whole weapon. And in a matter of days, it brought the greatest empire in human history to its knees. This is the story of how that happened, and of what it revealed about who actually runs the world. Because the lesson buried in this story is one that governs your life right now, in 2026, whether you know it or not. To understand how a single phone call could break an empire in a weekend, you first have to understand why a narrow ditch of water cut through the Egyptian desert mattered so much in the first place. The Suez Canal was not just a canal. It was the jugular vein of the British Empire. It opened in 1869 after a decade of brutal construction, a 120-mile artificial waterway joining the Mediterranean to the Red Sea, and from there to the Indian Ocean and everything beyond. Before it existed, a ship sailing from London to India had to go all the way around the southern tip of Africa, a journey of more than 12,000 miles. With the canal, that distance was cut roughly in half. That was the difference between weeks and days, between profit and loss, between an empire that could project power across the planet and one that simply could not. And by the middle of the 20th century, something like 2/3 of Europe's oil was passing through that single channel of water. But the canal was not owned by Egypt. It was owned by a company, a joint British and French enterprise, and Britain was its single largest shareholder, a position it had held since 1875, when a British Prime Minister, backed by a loan from the Rothschild banking house, snapped up the Egyptian ruler's shares from a man desperate for cash. From that moment on, Britain treated the canal as its private property and stationed tens of thousands of troops along its banks to make sure nobody forgot it. Egypt was, in practice, a British protectorate, and even after it gained a kind of nominal independence in the 1920s, British soldiers stayed, living in sprawling bases along the water, a permanent, visible reminder that Egyptian sovereignty had firm and humiliating limits. Think about how that felt from the Egyptian side. Something like 120,000 Egyptians had died digging that canal, and by the 1950s it was earning roughly $100 million a year, and almost none of that money stayed in Egypt. It flowed to Paris and to London. That is colonialism distilled to its essence, wealth pulled out of one nation's land and labor for the benefit of others, with the original owners left standing outside the gate. And eventually, a man came along who decided he had had enough. His name was Gamal Abdel Nasser, and he was not born to power. He was the son of a postal clerk from a small town far from the corridors of influence. But he had something that no amount of money or breeding can buy: an iron will and an almost supernatural instinct for the mood of his people. He grew up watching the British occupy his country, watching Egyptian politicians grovel before foreign powers, watching the wealth of his homeland drain out through that canal like blood from a wound, and he swore he would change it. In 1952, he and a group of young military officers overthrew the corrupt king who had let British influence fester for decades. The revolution was swift, nearly bloodless, and wildly popular. Within 2 years, Nasser was the unquestioned leader of Egypt, charismatic, fearless, and deeply suspicious of the Western powers who had carved up the Middle East after 2 world wars as casually as men carving a roast. He championed Arab nationalism, the idea that Arab peoples should control their own resources, their own governments, their own destinies, and that made him extraordinarily dangerous to London and to Paris. But Nasser was not merely a firebrand, he was a shrewd reader of the Cold War chessboard. America and the Soviet Union were locked in a global struggle for influence, and he saw a chance to play both sides. He recognized communist China, which infuriated Washington. He accepted weapons from a Soviet satellite state, which alarmed everyone in the West. And he demanded that the Western powers help finance his great dream. An enormous dam on the Nile that would control the flooding, generate electricity, and transform Egyptian agriculture. That dam was to be the centerpiece of his modernization program, the proof of what an independent Egypt could build. At first, the Americans and the British agreed to help fund it, but as Nasser kept flirting with Moscow, Washington's patience ran out. The American Secretary of State, a hard Cold War hawk who viewed every geopolitical move through the single lens of the communist threat, decided Nasser needed to be taught a lesson. In July of 1956, the United States abruptly withdrew its offer to finance the dam. Britain followed within hours, and the news was delivered with barely disguised contempt, with a public suggestion that Egypt's economy was too feeble to handle such a project anyway, a statement engineered to humiliate Nasser in front of the entire world. It was a catastrophic miscalculation. The theory was that pulling the money would humble Nasser, weaken him, perhaps even topple him. It did precisely the opposite. Nasser was on a plane returning to Cairo when he learned of it, and he was furious. But behind the fury was a cold, calculating mind that had been planning its next move for months. The Americans had just handed him the perfect excuse to make it. 1 week later, he stood before an enormous crowd in Alexandria and delivered a speech that changed the course of the 20th century. For nearly 3 hours he spoke, his voice rising and falling with the rhythm of a man who understood exactly what rhetoric can do. He recounted the long history of foreign domination. He spoke of the 120,000 Egyptians who had died digging the canal. He mocked British imperialism and American arrogance. And then, buried casually in the middle of the speech, almost as a throwaway, he said a name. The name of the French engineer who had built the canal. It sounded like nothing. It was not nothing. It was a code word. The instant that name left his mouth, Egyptian military units moved simultaneously to seize control of every installation along the length of the Suez Canal. By the time Nasser finished speaking, the canal belonged to Egypt. The crowd erupted. Across the Arab world, people poured into the streets. Nasser had done what no Arab leader had ever dared, seized the crown jewel of European colonialism and claimed it for his own people. And he did it with a lawyer's cleverness, promising to compensate the shareholders at the previous day's closing price on the Paris exchange, and declaring that the canal's revenues would now build his dam. It was a masterpiece of political theater, and it detonated like a bomb in the capitals of Europe. In London, the reaction was close to apoplexy. The British Prime Minister, Anthony Eden, got the news during a formal dinner at Downing Street, where one of his guests reportedly told him bluntly that Nasser had to be destroyed, quickly and completely. Eden needed no persuading. He was already consumed by an almost pathological hatred of the man, whom he habitually compared to Mussolini and to Hitler. And you have to understand why that comparison mattered so much to him personally. Eden had built his entire political identity on the principle that dictators must be confronted, never appeased. He had famously resigned from government in the 1930s in protest at the appeasement of fascist Italy. He had been right then, and being right had made him. Now, 2 decades later, he looked at Nasser and saw the same film starting again, a dictator who would only grow stronger with every concession. But Eden's judgment was compromised, And this is one of the strangest and most human elements of the whole story. A few years earlier, he had undergone a botched operation that left him in chronic pain and dependent on a cocktail of stimulants and sedatives. Historians have noted that in the months leading up to the crisis, his behavior grew increasingly erratic, marked by emotional outbursts, poor decisions, and an inability to sleep. The man steering Britain through one of the most delicate crises of the Cold War was, to put it plainly, impaired. His instinct was to retake the canal by force immediately. But there was a problem. Britain could not simply invade Egypt anymore. The age of gunboat diplomacy, when a European power could send warships anywhere on Earth and impose its will down the barrel of a gun, was over. The Second World War had rewritten the rules. The United Nations existed. The Cold War was raging, and every act had to be weighed for how it would look in the newly independent nations of Asia and Africa. And most importantly, the United States, Britain's indispensable ally, had made it unmistakably clear that it would not support military action. President Eisenhower was no starry-eyed anti-imperialist. He was a pragmatist, a former five-star general who understood power as well as any man alive. But he also understood that the world was turning. The age of European colonialism was ending, and any attempt to prop it up by force would drive the emerging nations straight into Soviet arms. He was also in the final stretch of a re-election campaign, and the last thing he wanted was to be tied to a colonial war. He told Eden, repeatedly through every channel available, that America would not back a military solution. Eden heard the words. He did not listen to them. What followed was one of the most audacious and self-destructive conspiracies in modern diplomatic history. In October of 1956, representatives of three nations gathered in a secluded villa in a quiet suburb of Paris. Israel sent its prime minister and its top military and defense officials. France sent its foreign and defense ministers. And Britain sent its foreign secretary and a senior deputy. Eden himself did not attend, communicating instead through messages, preserving a thin veil of deniability that would prove laughably transparent. Over 3 days, these men designed a plan of remarkable cynicism. Israel would launch an attack across the Sinai Peninsula toward the canal. Britain and France would then, with great public solemnity, issue an ultimatum to both Egypt and Israel, demanding that both sides pull their forces back 10 miles from the canal. But look closely at what that actually means. The canal was inside Egypt. So the ultimatum was demanding that Egypt withdraw from its own territory. When Egypt inevitably refused, Britain and France would intervene militarily, supposedly to separate the combatants and protect the waterway, while in reality seizing the canal, toppling Nasser, and restoring the old colonial order. The whole arrangement was written down and signed, and Eden was so horrified by the existence of a document proving it that he immediately sent his deputy back to Paris to retrieve and destroy every copy. The French refused. The Israelis, who treasured the paper as proof of their new alliance with Western powers, locked their copy safely away. The British copy was shredded on Eden's orders. That single act tells you that some part of him knew perfectly well that what he was doing was indefensible. Each conspirator had their own reasons. Israel faced a genuine security threat from Egypt, which had blockaded its access to the Red Sea and was backing guerrilla raids across its border. For its leadership, this was about survival. France was drowning in a savage colonial war in Algeria, and Nasser was openly arming and funding the Algerian rebels for Paris. He was not an Egyptian problem, but a direct threat to French control of North Africa. And for Britain, the canal was simply everything, the artery through which the oil flowed. But all three of them either ignored or fatally misjudged the one variable that actually mattered, which was how the United States would react. At the end of October, right on schedule, Israeli forces crossed into the Sinai, routing Egyptian positions and driving toward the canal. The military operation was executed brilliantly, reaching within 10 miles of the waterway exactly as the secret plan had specified. The next day, Britain and France issued their ultimatum. Nasser, exactly as everyone had predicted and indeed required, refused. The trap sprang shut. British and French aircraft began bombing Egyptian airfields, destroying Nasser's air force on the ground, and the invasion was underway. And in Washington, Eisenhower was incandescent. He had been blindsided by his closest allies, who had deliberately hidden a military invasion from him and launched it in the final week of an American presidential election. He saw the operation for exactly what it was, a colonial adventure dressed up in the vocabulary of peacekeeping, and he resolved to stop it. And here the story takes its extraordinary turn. Because Eisenhower did not reach for a military threat. He did not send the fleet. He did not even raise his voice in public. He reached for the dollar. To understand why that was so lethal, you have to understand what had happened to Britain's finances. Britain had won the Second World War, but the victory had bankrupted it. To fund the fight, it had borrowed staggering sums from the United States, from the Commonwealth, from anyone who would lend. By the end of the war, it owed a mountain of external debt that would take decades to work off. In 1945, America extended an enormous loan to help it rebuild, and that loan came with strings. Which meant, in a very real sense, that Britain's financial independence now rested on American goodwill. Meanwhile, the pound sterling was still the second most important currency on earth, the anchor of a vast network of nations, mostly current and former colonies, that pegged their money to it and held their reserves in it. On paper, that looked like power. In reality, it was a fragility. Because the pound's value was defended by Britain's holdings of gold and dollars, and in the autumn of 1956, those reserves stood at only a couple of $1 billion. That sounds like a lot. It was barely enough to cover a few months of imports. The pound was a castle built on sand, impressive from a distance, but vulnerable to the slightest tremor. And Eisenhower knew it precisely. The moment the bombs began falling on Egypt, the tremor arrived. International confidence in sterling collapsed. Investors began dumping the pound on the foreign exchange markets, and the Bank of England was forced to burn its precious dollar reserves trying to defend the currency's fixed exchange rate. In the first week of November alone, Britain hemorrhaged over $100 million from its reserves. Do the arithmetic on that rate of loss, and you arrive somewhere terrifying. Within weeks, Britain would be unable to pay for the food and the fuel it needed to import. Not unable to fight a war. Unable to feed and heat its own people. The Chancellor of the Exchequer, Harold Macmillan, the man responsible for Britain's money, had originally been one of the most aggressive hawks in the cabinet, pushing hard for military action against Nasser. But as the numbers on his desk turned from alarming to apocalyptic, he underwent one of the most abrupt conversions in political history, transforming almost overnight from chief hawk into the loudest voice demanding an immediate ceasefire. The reason was simple. The country was going broke. So Macmillan went to Washington with his hat in his hand. He asked the International Monetary Fund for an emergency loan of over $500 million to stabilize the pound. He asked an American bank for hundreds of millions more in credit. He asked for American oil to replace the Middle Eastern oil that was no longer flowing, because the canal was now blocked. And to every single request, Washington gave the same answer. No, not until you stop the war. Eisenhower's strategy was devastating in its simplicity. 3 coordinated financial strikes delivered at once. The first was blocking the IMF from giving Britain its credit. The United States was the largest shareholder in the fund, and nothing happened there without American consent. No assistance, Eisenhower made clear, until British troops were leaving Egypt. The second strike cut off the American credit lines, closing another lifeline at the exact moment Britain needed it. And the third strike was the killing blow, and it did not even have to be delivered. Eisenhower had his Treasury Secretary prepare to sell off the United States government's enormous holdings of British bonds on the open market. Think about what that meant. If Washington dumped that debt, it would trigger a catastrophic collapse in the value of the pound, wipe out Britain's remaining reserves, and potentially destroy the entire sterling system that held together a network of nations. It was the financial equivalent of a nuclear strike. And here is the thing. It never had to be carried out. The mere credible possibility of it was enough. On the morning of the 6th of November, the same day Eisenhower won his re-election in a landslide, Macmillan walked into Eden's office and delivered the arithmetic. Britain's reserves could not survive the current rate of loss. Accept a ceasefire now, or the pound collapses and within weeks the country cannot import enough food and fuel to sustain itself. It was ceasefire, or national bankruptcy. There was no third option. So Eden picked up the telephone. The conversation was brief and, by all accounts, deeply humiliating. Eden, exhausted and medicated and beaten, told the president he was prepared to accept a ceasefire, but that he wanted something back, a visit to Washington, a face-to-face meeting, some way to repair the shattered relationship. Eisenhower was initially cautiously warm, and then, within hours, his advisors talked him out of it, and the invitation was withdrawn. Eden was left with nothing at all. No canal, no Nasser overthrown, no American support, and no dignity. That afternoon, without so much as consulting the French or the Israelis, he announced a ceasefire. British and French troops were in the middle of advancing down the canal. They had taken their initial objectives and were pushing south. The commanders on the ground were stunned. They believed they could have had the whole canal within a day. The order came from London anyway. Stop. The whole military operation had lasted barely 48 hours. And the aftermath was brutal and bitterly ironic. Winston Churchill, retired and watching from the sidelines, delivered a private verdict that reads like an epitaph carved into stone. Asked whether he would have done what Eden did, he said he would never have dared launch it, and that having dared, he would never have dared to stop. Even Washington, once the ceasefire was in place, was contemptuous. The American Secretary of State, from his hospital bed, reportedly asked the British Foreign Secretary why on earth they had stopped, which must have felt like a knife going in. The implication was savage but accurate. If Britain was going to commit the crime of invading Egypt, it should at least have committed it properly. By stopping halfway, it earned the entire world's condemnation as an imperial aggressor while achieving precisely none of its objectives. It managed, as one historian put it, to get the worst of all possible worlds. An American intelligence official said something similar and even blunter at the time, that what Washington could not stomach was not the invasion or the withdrawal, but the hesitation. The bill came due immediately. Britain's reserves fell catastrophically through November. The canal itself was now blocked, deliberately sabotaged by Egypt, which had sunk ships in the channel. Middle Eastern oil stopped flowing. Petrol rationing was introduced across Britain in December and lasted for months. Families who had endured rationing all through the war, and who had only just begun to taste post-war comfort, found themselves queuing for basics all over again, because their government had gambled and lost. Only once British troops actually began withdrawing did Washington relent and let the emergency loan through. The financial crisis was stabilized. The political damage was permanent. Eden left for a recuperative holiday in the Caribbean at the end of November, a decision so tone-deaf it is almost hard to believe. A prime minister sunning himself in Jamaica while his countrymen queued for petrol. In his absence, his colleagues maneuvered to push him out. He resigned in January of 1957, citing his health, though everyone understood the real reason. And he was replaced, in an act of extraordinary political irony, by Macmillan, the very man who had been among the loudest advocates for the invasion, who had misread the Americans, who had failed to sound the alarm about the vulnerability of the pound, and who had then flipped and demanded the ceasefire once the consequences threatened him personally. His rise from the wreckage is one of the great feats of survival in British political history, and a permanent reminder that in politics, accountability is usually the first casualty. The consequences rippled outward for decades. For Britain, this was the end of empire, not in the sense that the colonies were surrendered overnight, that would take another decade and more. But in the sense that Suez destroyed forever the illusion that Britain could act as an independent great power. It proved with brutal clarity that Britain could no longer pursue any foreign policy that contradicted the wishes of the United States. That famous special relationship, which British politicians had invoked for years as proof of their enduring global relevance, was exposed as something else entirely, a relationship between a patron and a client. When the patron said stop, the client stopped. Macmillan understood this perfectly, and as Prime Minister he set about repairing relations with Washington with real skill. But the price of that repair was permanent subordination. From Suez onward, Britain would never again mount a major military operation without American approval. France drew the exact opposite conclusion from the same disaster. Where Britain decided it must never again defy the United States, France decided it must never again depend on it. That single decision runs straight through the following decades, into France's determination to build its own nuclear weapons, its withdrawal from NATO's integrated military command, and its enduring insistence on strategic autonomy. Modern French foreign policy was, in a real sense, born in the ashes of Suez. For Egypt and the wider Arab world, Nasser emerged as a hero of near-mythic stature. And notice the strangeness of that, because militarily he had been beaten. His army was routed in the Sinai, his air force was destroyed on the ground. Egyptian soldiers died in significant numbers. None of that mattered. What mattered was that he was still standing, the canal was still Egyptian, and the European invaders had been forced to slink away in humiliation. His portrait went up in homes and shops from Morocco to Yemen. He became the living symbol of Arab nationalism, the man who defied the West and won. And for the United States, Suez set a precedent that would define its conduct for the next 70 years. Eisenhower had demonstrated, in front of the whole world, that financial leverage could accomplish what armies could not, that the dollar was a weapon of unmatched precision. That lesson was not lost on any American president who followed. Economic pressure, sanctions, and control of the plumbing of the international financial system became the primary instruments through which American power is projected. Suez was, in a very real sense, the birth of the modern American financial empire, the moment the dollar replaced the gunboat. But the deepest lesson of Suez is the one about the relationship between money and sovereignty. In 1956, Britain was still a formidable military power. Its forces were well-trained and battle-hardened. Its navy was among the largest on Earth. It possessed nuclear weapons. And none of it mattered in the slightest once the Americans decided to go after the pound. Military power without a financial foundation to sustain it was revealed to be an illusion, a costume. An empire can survive a lost battle. It can even survive a lost war. It cannot survive a lost currency. The canal stayed Egyptian. It was cleared and reopened the following spring, and Egypt ran it efficiently, confounding the British and French insistence that Egyptians lacked the competence to manage their own waterway. The tolls that had once flowed to shareholders in London and Paris now funded Egyptian development. The Great Dam was eventually built with Soviet help. And out of the wreckage came something genuinely constructive, the first United Nations peacekeeping force, born of the diplomacy that ended the crisis, an idea that has been deployed around the world ever since. So here is the uncomfortable truth sitting at the center of this story. The world is not really governed by armies and navies, at least not in the way most people imagine. It is governed by money, by the flow of capital, by the value of currencies, by the willingness of creditors to lend, and the ability of debtors to repay. Britain learned that in the most painful way available, standing on the banks of the canal with its soldiers victorious and its economy dissolving beneath their boots. The greatest empire the world had ever seen was not defeated by a foreign army. It was defeated by a phone call and a threat to sell some bonds. And when you look around at the world right now, ask yourself what has actually changed. The instruments are more sophisticated now. sanctions regimes, exclusion from the international payment system, frozen central bank reserves, export controls on the technology a rival needs to compete. But the underlying principle is exactly the one Eisenhower demonstrated in 1956. Money is power, and whoever controls the plumbing of the global financial system holds a weapon that no army can defend against. He understood that 70 years ago. Britain learned it the hard way, and every nation on earth has been quietly living inside that lesson ever since. If this story made you think differently about power, about money, and about how empires actually rise and fall, consider subscribing to the channel and dropping a like on this one. There are plenty more stories like it waiting to be told, stories about the invisible forces that shape the world we live in. I will see you in the next one.